Hello, welcome everybody to our third speaker or I think fourth speaker now in our series of Black History Month speakers. My name is Allison Henline. I'm the Education and Outreach Manager here at Shaker Historical Society. And tonight I am bringing you the wonderful Crystal Montgomery, who is going to be talking about historic preservation and her life and her job and her career as a historic preservationist, focusing on architectural preservation. So I'm here to remind everybody that this is being live streamed via a Zoom call with Crystal and our SHS members, as well as live streamed to Facebook. So if you're watching this on Facebook or watching this in our Zoom call, please feel free to comment and chat down below or in the chat section any questions or comments or any opinions that you have along the way. We are encouraging you to, be engaged in this presentation. There's lots of cool information that is going to be coming up. So feel free and feel liberated to comment, chat as you wish, and we will get to your questions at an appropriate time, likely the end of this presentation. So without further ado, I'm here to introduce Crystal Montgomery, who is going to be giving her talk on historic preservation.
Hello, everyone. How are you this evening? I hope a Tuesday was good for everyone. It was good for me. I will be talking about historic preservation, but before I get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I went to school for architecture at the University of Cincinnati, and the University of Cincinnati will be in my presentation because there's lots of things that have happened there, and it fits right in. But I went to school for architecture and got a certificate in historic preservation because I knew that I would like to work or be connected or do anything with old buildings versus new buildings. The old ones, I guess, growing up here in Shaker Heights, all these English Tudors and all these lovely houses just turned me on. So I wanted to know more about them. I work at the NASA Glenn Research Center as a historic preservationist, but we do an additional part that maybe most don't, and that is the cultural resource management. Cultural resource management is taking care and protecting assets above ground, which are buildings, and assets below ground, which is archaeology, which we don't run into too much, but the cultural part comes into Native Americans who have a culture, and especially on sites. And the culture is connected to those sites, but we don't have too much to deal with on that end. So most of my work is above ground. So as working for a government agency, we have to consult with the State Preservation Office. And in the presentation, we'll go over how all this kind of got put together. But when we have an undertaking or do anything to our buildings, we must consult the state. But once we had a historic resources survey done and identified what is actually historic and what is not, that kind of made things a little bit simpler, so we don't have to consult on everything. And another thing that we can do is write agreements where we can kind of streamline our process, kind of cut down the consultation. So that has helped. So I'm getting to the place where, I may not have much to do anymore. We have so much in place now. Another thing that's great about my job is that we get to meet with all the other NASA centers once a year, have a face-to-face meeting. So I can say I've been to maybe 8 different locations that NASA has, which has been wonderful. And I go there and I look at it differently than any other probably preservationist at NASA. I go there and I look at their buildings and I look at how they're designed and how compatible they are with each other, how well their campus is kept. I don't say anything to them because I'm sure they don't want to hear my opinion of their campus. But, and I do the same with our campus. So I guess it's just in me to just look at everything and assess it. If there's anything else you want to know about what I do, you can ask a question at the end, but I'm going to go ahead and get started because I guess I could talk about historic preservation and what I do all night and we'll never get to the presentation. So We're going to find out how historic preservation began and can it end? Well, I have the answer for that already, even before I wrote this. It began with, well, it didn't begin, but the stopping point, or a good point in 1966, it came to a head that we, the Congress, needed to create a National Historic Preservation Act, and it happened in 1966. 66. I'll go all the way back to 1853 with the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. They were, typically the very first preservationists because they wanted to preserve George Washington's home, Mount Vernon. They didn't want to see it deteriorate. And then the Antiquities Act came, the National Park Service. They they came about in 1916, and National Park Service, we're going to talk more about them. Then Historic Sites Act, and then Historic American Building Survey, the National Trust of Historic Preservation was developed, and National Interstate of Defense Highways Act in 1956. We're going to really talk about that one. Why was the act needed? It was needed because there was a lot of historic property that was being demolished without regard to what anybody else thought about it. The importance of historic preservation was heightened when the nation was undergoing significant economic and social change. It was part of the 1960s movement of urban planners and architects to make cities and towns livable and to preserve some of the character of the past. In the 50s, when the interstate highways were being developed, that was like a massive destruction of property without anyone thinking about who is going to be in the path of the highways. They didn't care. Of course, this is the government doing this. So when all of that property was being destroyed, the public, the communities are the ones who suffered. So they stood up and they finally got Congress to pass the act. And then from then on, everything else has been developed. But Shaker Heights was a part of this with the Clark Freeway. It was after the act, but still, here's the government going again. They wanted to put a boulevard where you can go maybe 55 miles an hour down Shaker Boulevard, right in the middle. And I do believe the Rapid was going down in the middle of that. And then they wanted to put another one down Lee Road. So, and it was going to tear up a whole lot of property. Good old Shaker Heights fought a battle that lasted for 7 years, but we won. Purpose of the act: to develop regulatory guidance for federal agencies to ensure that preservation of the country's history that is found in the built environment, buildings, structures, districts, sites, and objects is fully integrated into every agency's program, planning, and achievement of missions. And you see how I said the federal agency? Now, once the act was passed, the State Preservation Office was developed. The Advisory Council of Historic Preservation, that's another government agency that was developed. The Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and then the National Historic Landmarks and National Register Historic Places, and the Section 106 review process. That's a big one. Actually, I'll tell you about the Section 106 review process. As long as any project has any federal money or involvement, that project is going to need a Section 106 written. And it has to go to the State Preservation Office, because actually what this act has done is kind of slow down everyone's thinking and put in a process to make you think about how what you're doing is affecting others. And then those others, they can be participating parties and express their opinion. And if it's a historic property versus a non-historic property, then agencies have to have a public meeting, and then the public can really come in and express what they like and what they don't like. And then we'll go from there to find out if we go ahead with the project or if we make some kind of adjustments or just don't do the project at all and anything else in between. So what is historic property? Defined by the National Preservation Act as amended. It's been amended 23 times since it was since it came into process. Either property listed on the National Register or eligible for listing on the National Register, that is historic property. So it has to have some type of detailing to make it historic. Just not any old building that's old is historic property. And here's the criteria for determining what's historic. Any event made by significant contribution, broad patterns of history, meaning, let's say, since this is Black History Month, let's pick on Martin Luther King. Let's say Martin Luther King's house, if he lived there, then that would be historic property under criteria A. Lives of a person significant in their past. Well, we'll pick on Martin again. He's significant. Criteria C, embody the distinctive characteristics of a type of construction or that presents artistic value of his values district. I think part of my page is cut off here. But anyway, if there is a building type, let's take my favorite, English Tudor, that has distinct details in it that you can't find anywhere else, then that particular style should be preserved. And then we have criteria considerations. They go from A to G, but G is the only one that really applies. And if you fall under criteria G, it means that your project or your building structure object is something significant more than just being 50 years old. And also, we start looking at buildings after they turn 50. And it's kind of like buildings have to start going to the doctor. You have to start paying attention to them and start fixing them up and trying to keep them as long as possible and protect them. But if you have something significant, like my example will be the Twin Towers. The Twin Towers were not 50 years old when the planes flew into them, but because of the disaster that happened, that made them significant. And also the buildings, sites, objects, and structures have to have integrity of location, design, setting, material, workmanship, feeling, and association. So historic preservation is these four things: rehabilitation, restoration, reconstruction, and preservation. So if you're doing any of these four, you're doing historic preservation. Now, the Secretary of Interior Standards, they have developed standards under each category of preservation. And the one that we use the most is rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is making changes to buildings. Of course, restoration is restoring something, and reconstruction is reconstruction something that's broken and needs fixed, and you have to reconstruct it back to its original shape. And then preservation is preserving. Then there's another document. It's 240 pages, but it's awesome though. And it tells you things to look for and how to protect, conserve your materials, and more. Now, let's go back in time, and we're going to go over the history of modern architecture. The industrial, and of course this happened right at the turn of the century. That's a fascinating part of our history, and this is just the architectural part of it. The Industrial Revolution brought on rapid economic growth, establishing many self-made wealthy tycoons. I'm going to call them tycoons, those guys that were making money like you wouldn't believe back then, who wanted to build houses, large houses, to show off their successes. This was known as the Gilded Age. The tycoons looked to Europe, whose buildings were historic, whose buildings and history can date back to the 15th century or older. At this time, America was relatively new, a new country, and had no old buildings. Nothing here was old. So the tycoons on their trips to Europe would bring back pieces of a building or a house to be installed in their new house to help it look old as Europe looked old. They wanted the prominence that Europe had, so their homes had to be something never seen before. To help them get there, Richard Morris Hunt, the first architect to be educated in Paris, was the man for the job. There's a school in Paris called the École des Beaux-Arts, and a lot of European architects went to school there, but Richard Morris Hunt was the very first one, but there's been many after him. Modern architecture dates back to the Industrial Revolution too. It made the transition from making things by hand to making things with a machine. Precision was appealing. Construction technology and engineering had advanced rapidly, and new materials were introduced, such as cast iron, reinforced concrete, steel, and glass. These materials would allow buildings to be built stronger, lighter, and taller. Another technological advancement was the lift, later called the elevator, assisted in making buildings taller. Young architects were excited about creating new designs with new materials never seen before. At the, at the same time, the tycoons were looking back to Europe for designs that were old, while the new generation of architects were looking forward to a new era of innovation. Then the modern movement comes. All of this together brought on a revolt of new beliefs that traditional methods and historical styles were no longer viable. That's what the new generation thought. The new generation, they wanted to have the freedom of experiment and creating new forms, a new type of style in architecture. The main idea the new generation of architects had was to emphasize the structure of buildings and its function, as well as rejecting ornamentation and any decoration on a building. The good parts, they wanted to get rid of the good parts. But the design of the buildings were to be determined by function, and material were form would be clearly displayed out front and not hidden between walls. The goal was to shift the eye to the construction, as it was the beautiful part of the building, as they thought. They also wanted their abilities and knowledge of their current time to be the basis of their designs and not be tainted with tradition. So they did not go to the École des Beaux-Arts. Modern architecture also began to think about how humans lived and how they used the environment. So the first ones were, everyone knows Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Sullivan, L.L. Sheridan, and Charles René Mackintosh in Scotland, and Tony Gotti and Edwin Lutyens. I don't know that much about Lutyens, but I think everyone has seen this bench, which was done by him. That has been famous here in America. And Charles René Mackintosh, he did, hope everyone can see my cursor, the Glasgow School of Art. I went to Scotland and I got a chance to see the exterior. We were too late to go inside, but we got to see the exterior, so I'm happy about that. And then Frank Lloyd Wright, I didn't put his most famous building in here, but this is the Winslow House. I know some of you know these, but just in case others don't, I'll say them for them. So that was the first generation of moderists. And they, when they made their designs, they were subtle and still used some ornament, but they didn't go all out like the architecture before. So the second generation was part of the 30s Europeans coming from other countries like Germany. So when they're coming to America, they're bringing their ideas because they had modernists there also. They also had a school called the Bauhaus, and that's where Walter Gropius and Mies van der Rohe, those two were at that school and teaching. So Le Corbusier, he was a Frenchman, and Philip Johnson, he was American, and L.L. Saarinen, he's the son of the other Saarinen. He had a father and son. So actually this building here, that's by Walter Gropius, and you probably have seen it before. It's at the corner of Chagrin and Warrensville. And if you remember, I was saying that the young modernists want to see the structure of the building. They didn't want to hide it. So this building here, this is Crown Hall in Chicago. So this is a structure, and of course it's shown, it's not hidden, but this was a new generation of design because normally a building sits on the foundation, but this building was hung from its structure. So that's what made it famous. And it's just a rectangle. I'm not hiding anything else from you. And then Ariel Saarinen, he did the Gateway Arch in St. Louis out of stainless steel, another new material. Le Corbusier did Villa Savoy. And here you see the columns. You're looking at the structure. They want you to see the structure. So they did. Now, the next set of modernists, this is postmodern architects. This is after World War II. These five guys were called the New York Five. So when these guys came along, and of course some other ones, these just happen to be the popularized ones, that designs really started to change. Modernists always want to design something that would shock everyone, but most subtle about it were the beginning architects. Now these guys, um, the computer program was used to design with an X and Y coordinates, but when the U and the V coordinates came out, all these sculptural designs that we see now, this computer system let them design it better and faster. Frank Gehry, he has done a lot of sculptural buildings that are not compatible anywhere, but you know what? He doesn't care. This is Peter B. Lewis at Case Western Reserve University. And as you can see, this building's put in a historic context. Here's a historic building here, another one here, another one there, and the other one is hidden. But when Frank Gehry went to design his building, he did not consider the context of what was around. He wanted a modern building, and Peter B. Lewis. So they got their modern building without respect to all the other buildings around it. Controlling modern architecture. Modern architecture designs are getting harder and harder to try to get them to be compatible with its surroundings. We're going to talk about compatibility a little bit later. Part of the reason is designers and clients, they're guilty just as much as the designer because no architect can build anything if they didn't have a client. So part of the reason is designers and clients want to do their own thing without regard to what is existing, to what is currently already built. They're going to do whatever they want. When developers and politics get involved, there isn't much hope for historic buildings because contemporary designs seem to want to take over and muscle their way in. There's more money to be made in buildings. There's more money to be made in building a new multifamily complex on a site for single family homes than building single family homes. Um, this is just one scenario because if you build a multifamily complex that's however many stories tall, of course you can get more people in, you can pull more tax dollars, and of course that makes the developer happy because he's making all kinds of money. And if you build single family homes, you won't draw as much money on that same amount of acreage. Um, I have two great examples. I don't have photographs of them, but I'll tell you about them. Hopefully you've heard about them already. Top of the Hill, that's a high rise that's going up in Cleveland Heights. It's not under construction. And of course, you know, as preservationists hope it will never be under construction. But anyway, it is being put in a historic district where there's nothing else that looks like this contemporary building. And there's not too many high rises in that historic district. And the design of it's not taken into account. It's context all around it. And if you go up Cedar Hill, it'll be right there in front of you when you're coming up the hill going toward, I guess, on Cedar Road. Another example is the Ambly Village Historic District. It has beautiful historic homes in it, but this one person wanted to buy a home that was for sale. It wasn't, the prettiest of the houses, but their intent was to tear it down and build a modern house. So, of course, Cleveland Heights has a lot of fights on their hands. But when someone has a lot of money, sometimes that wins, unfortunately. Here we go. Guidelines for historic preservation, implementing the standards. New construction has no standards. So, but I've written guidelines for them, and I kind of put them together myself as far as what should happen when you put in a new building or fill or an infill. Okay, compatibility. These are several definitions. If you can think of it as you read them, this is a building I'm talking about, and not just a person. That a feeling of sympathy and friendship. That's what a building should look like next to each other, next to another. It should look like its friend, or they should have the same mindset. And when you put a building like Peter B. Lewis next to a historic, let's say a Tudor, they're not thinking the same way. They're not of the same mindset, the same mind. So contemporary, complementary, harmonious, coordinated, well balanced, conflict free, cooperative, cordial minded, like minded, and part of a family. If we can get our city and communities to look like this, or when you see a community, it looks like, everything around it, they're talking to each other. They're not all just doing their own thing. Rehabilitation, that's when you're making changes to a building. So when you put an addition on, this is also a controversial part of historic preservation. When you have a historic building and you need to put an addition on, how do you do that? Well, the best way is to put it in the rear or on the side. And if it is on the side, just kind of screen it to kind of hide it, because the facade, the front view of the building is the most important, and you don't want anything else to take away from that. If you put a connector onto a historic building to connect your addition, you try to put your connector on where you don't cover up your character defining features of the historic building. So if that addition ever comes down, that the features are still left intact. Another way to put an addition on a building is from the top, a rooftop addition. So if you do a rooftop addition, you set it back from the facade. So again, it's not taken away from the facade of the historic building. And then you don't want to make it too large, but the main thing is to set it back from the facade. And mechanical units typically can go on the roof of a building. So same thing, you want to set back, and you can actually put a wall around the mechanical unit that maybe coordinates with the color of the building, so your eye's not drawn to it. You always want your eye to go to the historic building and to the front facade, because those are the most important. And if you do an addition like this one here, where your historic building, where your additions actually turn out to be larger than your historic building, then you just overwhelmed it and the historic building gets lost. It's like the additions are more important now because they're so much larger. And we don't want that. So I have marked where I've gotten some of these photographs, so some of them you can go back and look at it. The historic preservation briefs are an excellent reference about historic preservation. And this is where the national park comes in, because they made the preservation brief. There are 50 of them now. But what they did was they would go out and do a project and document it. That's where these briefs have come from. So when they would do a project, because they document it, then everyone else is able to learn from them. So that's very nice of them. So here was a historic building that needed an addition. So they did it right. They put it in the back. They use complementary material, brick, and the windows are not so bad. So I marked this appropriate. Oh, another thing about this that was good. The roof of the addition, you can see it here, how it didn't go higher than this detail. They made sure it came underneath so they didn't destroy it. And if they did go higher, well, they probably couldn't because they have windows then. And windows are character defining features too, but they did a good job right here, good detail. Let's take this one here, do the appropriate ones. Actually, I have more inappropriate ones to show than I do appropriate. Again, we have an addition. Because this is a photograph, I don't know if this is the front or the side, but it looks like the side. So the addition is put in the back. They use a connector and they have the same verticality as they do with the historic building, even though the historic one has a divider. They did a pretty good job here. And the glass connector, that's okay. It goes with the verticality here and verticality there. And they use the same type of material. Colors weren't way off. So this one's appropriate. They did a good job. Now the next one, the addition is put in. It's kind of strange how they did this, but anyway, they have a new roof that slopes upward. Therefore, it's taken away from the front facade, even from a distance. That helps. But on the sides, they have all the glass, and it's not compatible with the windows that are here. So this one gets inappropriate. Sorry. The the Cleveland Museum of Art. Once you go inside, of course, it's a beautiful, beautiful museum, and I love it too. I know you do too. But the additions on it have overwhelmed the historic building. The historic building started off pretty small, but that's all they needed at the time this was built. So all of this is the addition, and it covers it, the historic building. I think it comes up to here, pretty much on all three sides, definitely all the back. It just overwhelms. So it's not an appropriate addition from historic preservation point of view. But when you look at this view here, it's a nice design on its own. And it's had two editions and both of them are striped. That's why I put this picture here, because this is the first edition. The stripes are a little bit different. It's darker. I think it's narrower. These are wider and lighter and brighter. So you definitely can tell which one's the edition and which one is not. But of course, once you go in, and of course, in the atrium area, you know, it's a fantastic space, fantastic. This one has a rooftop addition also, and the designers thought it was a good idea. The easiest solution, this is what they said, the easiest solution was found in an unlikely place, the roof. The rooftop addition reinvigorated the aging structures through new materials and innovation through form while still complementing their context. Well, they didn't have my rules, and also this is a different country, but it's a good example of what not to do, because it looks completely different from the historic building. It hasn't complemented at all by color. It is set back, because actually when you use it, looking at the standards and using that for justification, that's pretty much where everyone goes for justification of judging what's done correctly and what's not correct. Appropriate, inappropriate is the standards. But you try to kind of make it look like it's part of the family. And this one doesn't look like it's part of the family. Another thing that is part of the standards, and it's the most controversial part, is that the National Park Service thinks that your additions to historic buildings should be differentiated, that they should not look like the original verbatim, that they should look like their time of when they're being built and with current materials. But because it's controversial, it's like how much differentiation and how much compatibility should look like the building. But if you rely on just making it look like it's part of the family, you can take some parts from the historic building, some design features, and put them in the new part. And that way, there's some kind of relationship going on. Here, these two, they look like enemies. And this is another one, another rooftop addition, but this particular one had another addition and they connected it. This is your connector in the middle. So using the same material to connect the historic and the contemporary, well, it works with the contemporary, but when you look at this here, it doesn't sit back. And actually this looks like the side, it may not be the front. So I can only judge so much. But I just wanted to show that this contemporary material looks alien, foreign to this here, to the historic part. And that's where I think we need to do better at making it look like they're related somewhere. Another thing that you don't want to mimic your historic building completely because they'll look like a false sense of history. It will not look the same or have the same feeling and association as the historic one. So this particular one did a rooftop addition too, and they did pretty good job here because they used all the same color. They did introduce these columns that the historic building did not, but columns are of the same time of when this was built, so it was appropriate. The cornice here, I'm not really crazy about the cornice because they're trying to match this cornice and you really can't match it. So when you can't match something, you should do something a little bit different. That way it doesn't look like you're matching. Um, this building here has an addition, which there's not much to it. They put one window in, which kind of goes with the verticality of the windows that are here, even if they're not, separated. And they do have the round vault. And they do use brick. It is a little bit different color, but the texture is heavier here than it is here. So you can definitely tell that this is new. So some of these I'm on the fence. I put appropriate and inappropriate, but this one I chose inappropriate. This is a house that's in Chagrin Falls. I think it was built in the 1800s, but the owner wanted to put an addition on. The addition was a garage. They wanted to put a 3-car garage addition onto a building of this detailing. Now, the part that I would say that doesn't work very well is you can't match this type of construction. We just don't build this way at all. We don't make designs like this at all. So when they want to make an addition, they took the design of a barn. In Chagrin Falls, some of the barns there are pretty stylish, but they are barns and they're not connected to the main house. So putting a connector on this type of house that, was probably built in a horse and buggy day and saw the evolution of the car was never meant to have something really added onto it. And if you did, it really isn't going to be appropriate. So what they did here is take 2 different styles, 2 different uses, and connected it. And to me, that doesn't work at all. I'm not sure what color they're using, but just the roof style of the two, um, I don't know what to say. I do know what to say. It's inappropriate. Another thing that they did was they changed the main entrance from the historic house. You don't get the same feeling as if it were in the 1800s or, in the early 1900s, because now that you have a connection to the house, you have a connector here, and this is your main entrance now. So the house is being used in a modern way where you pull your car into your garage and you get out, go through the connector to get into your house, as opposed to putting your car in the garage or your horse and buggy and then having to walk to the house. So I guess I've said enough about this one. Now, this is the all-time worst edition ever. Hearst Castle in New York City, and I've got a chance to see it in person, and it's just as bad in person as it is in a picture. New construction. Even though I can't share my historic district guidelines, I can share my outline. This is part of it. So all these things you need to look at when you're designing a new building and putting it within a historic district or just a historic context. Here are some examples I kind of drew out. So scale. You don't want your new building to be taller than your existing buildings, and you don't want it to be too small. Something kind of compatible. Height. If you want to make your building higher, still the historic part is the most important part. So you take your addition and set it back, and then you can go higher. And setbacks. All these buildings are set back the same amount from the street. You don't want to take your new building and set it back further. It's not being compatible, or you don't want to bring it even closer out toward the street. You want to kind of keep it somewhere in line with the others. You can go out a little bit and come back a little bit, but not drastically. Here's a new house in the midst of historic homes, and it is taller than all the others. Its roof style is different. Windows are not compatible. It steps, porch, that's okay. I don't see the whole street, but I can only judge by the picture. The color is different. So this is what modernists like to do. They want their work to stand out. And this is one way that they can do that. They just don't do what the historic building has. They do the opposite. So this one's inappropriate. And actually its setback is in between these two buildings. All right, here's the reverse. You have a small historic building and two large ones were built around it and just kind of just hovering over it, where it's not important anymore. These larger ones, they're saying we're the important ones. And the detailing, the styling of it, these new ones are completely different than what was there first. So it's overwhelming. Now this one's in Europe. I'm not sure where. It looks like London. But here's our historic building. And here is our new building, which is over here too. This is where, a lot of it's appropriate. A lot of it's inappropriate. That's why I'm on the fence as to which one it should be. They did pretty good with the color. They did pretty good with the windows. You're not going to match the historic windows exactly, but they did use, windows that are still cut in. They didn't have continuous bands. Looks like the flower pots. That's not compatible. But anyway, this part here, the storefront, it is of a different color and different material, because on the historic building, they used the same color, but they did have a texture. So, they have a texture, it's a different texture, but they have windows that are taller than what's on the historic one. So, and yeah, they do the molding, to separate the first floor and the upper floors, which they do here. So there's a lot of similarities. They use the same color roof, and it's um, looks like a mansard roof, which is similar to the historic one. So, they did some things good, and some things, kind of on the fence. That's why I, went ahead and put both in there. Hopefully, I don't have to be the one to decide on that one. The Getty Center in Los Angeles. If you don't want to be compatible and want to do your own thing, you're going to be up on a hill where there's no context around you, so you can do whatever you want. So this is appropriate. That was an easy one. This is at Xavier University in Cincinnati. I wanted to show you some type of campus planning, how something fits in within a campus and not just individually within the city or, a neighborhood with a house. So this is a historic part of Xavier. It's all like tan color. But as they added on and built new, they kept the color together, all the same color. And this is a new construction. They have, vertical windows here, which they don't on the historic building. But the whole campus is really tied together by the color. So when you have different styles of architecture, they don't stand out as being so different because the color has made them compatible. And then here's the University of Cincinnati across the town from Xavier. And they have pretty much demolished their whole campus and have built new. So one of the rules of historic preservation that you do not demolish a building with the purpose of building new. And UC has taken pretty much everything down and rebuilt their colleges. All the colleges are like a complex that doesn't go with the next college design or the next one. Each college has their own separate design. So everything is very eclectic there. Here's another Frank Gehry building. This is an unconventional way of using brick because when you use brick, brick is looked at as heavy, that you can't form it this way. This is a new building, and the context around it is something here that's brick color. So by color, it looks like it's compatible, but the shape is not compatible at all. It's doing its own thing. So when you have a building that does that, it's like it's saying it's to me, I call it a selfish building because it doesn't care about anything else. It only cares about itself and what it looks like, and standing out that when you drive down MLK Boulevard, you'll look at it and think, what is that? So eventually you get used to it, but not compatible. Now, this is the architecture building at UC, and this is the first one of the first complex, which was DAAP, that was rebuilt. And none of the other ones, like I said before, look like it at all. And this is Peter Eisman. He's one of the New York Five. So for some reason, he liked pastels. So as you're driving down the street again, here, of course, you're going to look up and see this. And a couple things you're going to see at first. What is that? Look at the colors. And is it falling down? It looks like it's tipping over. Is it going to fall? So that's part of the shock that these guys want to have. They want you to think this. So on this side, I'm sorry, over here, that's what this picture is showing, this side. And this is the historic part. So the opposite side is where we have the new part. All this here is new and connect to the existing here. So you really don't have the same view of what you see here. You see the historic part, then you see the new part over here. So that's why I have it inappropriate and appropriate, because two different facades, even though it's the same building, I guess you would know they're the same building. Maybe I should just make it all inappropriate. And here's the interior, give you a feel what the interior looks like. And if you look hard enough, when we get to the question and answer part, You can tell me if you recognize anybody in that building. Here, now we're back to Cleveland. The Museum of Modern Art sits on the corner. And this, of course, is Case Western Reserve. So all of this is all new. Whatever was there, they tore it down. And on the other side is some more of the new, some more of the same that's new. And this building is existing with brick. And we have some brick here, little, like a mid-rise. But when it was time to do a museum, we got ourselves a stylish, looks, from the air, it looks like a cube, which the material is not compatible with anything all around it. By the shine, by the color, the roof, there's nothing compatible here. So it's doing its own thing too, and wanting the shock value. So they got it. Now, when we get to builders, when they came along, that's just another little screw into the historic preservation, because they don't want to do things correct either. They come up with their McMansion styles, making their houses bigger than existing ones. They'll put them in next to an existing house, like this one here. It's much, much taller. Actually, as the car evolved, is why garages are in the front of the houses now, because it's responding to how much we use our cars. We use our cars more than we go in and out of our front doors, because you go in the garage and you go into the house from the garage. So way too tall. Materials are okay. The color's okay. The windows are fine. The roof is just really the height. More rooftop additions that are inappropriate. Both of these are inappropriate. One for the color. Stands out, that you're looking up and you've seen something different. They don't set back. This color blends in a little bit with the stone, but still, it doesn't set back. It's not real compatible with the windows, especially these openings here. And this one just looks like someone dropped something on top of the building. Another addition here at the bottom. It's taller than the historic building. You shouldn't go taller. Actually, if you go a little bit taller, it's okay. The verticality here, it's a little bit more than what these windows are here, because the windows are small. And your color of the building, the brick, and it looks like it's got a little connector. That part's okay. I think the National Park, National Park agrees with me that's not compatible. Or I should say that I agree with them. Of course, we cannot forget our skyscrapers. Everyone would love to design a skyscraper. Now, skyscrapers started because, of course, steel was invented, but they started out being just a tower, not over the whole footprint of the building. That's the way they started until we got a little bolder. But here, look at this article. All these old skyscrapers, the historic ones, are being torn down so they can build new ones. Inappropriate. So here's the new ones. Now, the Flatiron Building in New York is still there. Sears Tower, it's still there. Chrysler Building, still there. Actually, all of these are still standing. Thank goodness. And here are some modern ones that I don't know where these are. They may be in a different country. But this is what everyone wants to see now, the new. Now, I have a quote here. Actually, it's cut off. I can't read it all. Well, there we go. Every building is modern in its time. We see and read each building and its contributions to the city more clearly against a historical context. Sensitivity to the context is very important, while copying is bad. Now, Richard Rogers, he does a lot of contemporary work, but he probably gets it more so than other modernists. So if we slow down tearing down buildings, if we scale back modern designs, and if we protect historic property, we all are working together here to have a more compatible continuity in our designs within our cities. I have another quote. This was an old one, but still good. Regardless of style and composition, all architecture should avoid the negative effects of drastic or excessive contrast and fragmentations and interruptions in the continuity of the urban fabric and space. Priority should be given to continuity of composition that does not adversely affect the existing architecture, but at the same time allows a deserving creativity that embraces the spirit of the place. Questions?
Great. So thank you so much, Crystal, again, for that really informative, I found that to be incredibly informative presentation. We have a lot of comments and questions kind of mixed in, mixed bag here on our Facebook page. So I'm going to be reading those in the way that they're coming up on my screen. So they might be a little bit previously mentioned in your talk. So like I said, I'm just going to go from oldest to newest. If I miss anybody, I'm really sorry. I'm going to do my best. So Mark has commented a couple of times on some of your discussion that you were having. And his first question is about showing the structure from an inside out building. So he asks, have you ever seen the Centre Pompidou in France? It's a perfect example of showing the structure an inside out building.
Yes, I have. They built the whole stairway on the exterior of the building. So that's a lot of structure on the outside.
Next up is Chiquita Montgomery. She says, even though Peter B. Lewis doesn't go with the surrounding buildings, it still looks cool seeing the stainless steel sheets in the skyline. It's more of a comment than a question.
Thank you.
Mark again asks, I think if done right, combining old and new can bring out the best qualities of both. Walking down the street in New York or London, you'll have new glass skyscrapers next to and sometimes surrounding and over old churches and historic buildings. So I think you mentioned that in your talk a couple times. Somebody agreed with you that one of the things you brought up is not the best design, that there was nothing else to say and that it wasn't a good design. So I don't remember what that was referring to, but they agreed with you. So going down again, Mark comments again that about, I think this is referring to modern architecture versus historic architecture. These artists may be attempting to draw focus to their own work using contrasting appearance could be intentional, and having different generations of architecture can show the living and changing cityscape. Argument could be made that a perfect preservation isn't ever possible.
Well, that's very possible too. Nothing is perfect. And these guys definitely want their building seen, that's for sure.
And then Brianna mentions that her alma mater, RIT, which I believe is Rochester, has been listed as one of the ugliest campuses in the US because of all of the buildings using too much of the same orange brick. And then she says, too much of a bad thing.
Okay.
Going along. Somebody says that they learned a lot. So that's very good. Mark also says shock value could be considered a value, a building that makes you feel and think. I appreciate that you don't want to devalue any historical value. Having a building that defies logic or changes the landscape isn't by itself necessarily bad. But then again, preserving history can be difficult with hazards, like flammable materials, ADA compliance. But new buildings can serve their purpose, he thinks, better than old sometimes, and sometimes easier than repurposed old buildings. So I don't know if you have anything to add to him, but he's kind of going against some of your comments that you had made.
Well, that's okay. I was hoping I'd have one of these. That, of course, the historic buildings and the new ones are not going to mesh perfectly. But I just think we need to do a better job because some of the modern designs are just getting too outlandish, too excessive, too extreme, which, their clients are thinking that same way too. So that's why they get built. But it's, I won't say it bothers me, but why? It's like the modern builds are not trying to compete against each other, or maybe they are, and I don't know it. No, because I don't talk to modernists that often. But why does something need to stand out drastically? Just because it can?
I don't know. That's
It's throwing out, comments and, just throwing things out there. And,
yeah.
just it goes into a discussion if we were all, together better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. It's kind of hard to keep up with, there might be a lag or delay or anything like that. So they're definitely
And then
interesting.
also for this guy, another thing that is going on with modern design, it's not so much design, it's the quality. The quality of the building, they don't build to last anymore. Whereas the historic buildings, they weren't built to last, but the materials that they used were sustainable. That's not a good word. They were just lasting type materials, more so than what is used today. Because you can look at, let's see, my house I had in Cincinnati, it was built in 1935. That brick was in perfect condition. Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I would like to see this guy who likes all this modern stuff look at it 50 years or 60 years later and see if it's still in perfect condition. Then talk to me.
I feel like all of Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings are a perfect example of sometimes modern buildings aren't easiest to stay up to snuff sometimes. But that's just a personal opinion. So Lisa Payne Jones asks, there is a controversial new home on Van Eken. Do you think Shaker should limit the designs of its newer built homes?
Excellent question. And I do have an answer. And the answer is that the architectural review boards, because when you build something new or do a renovation, you have to go before the architectural review board. If you do not have the right people on that board, you're not going to get the right designs in your city. If you have a contemporary person on the architectural review board, they're going to like every modern design that's coming before them. So their view is going to be biased. So of course you want to get a variety and hopefully all preservationists, because when you're a preservationist, you try to judge things. I would say we try to judge things fairly, whereas modernists, they kind of, they want what they want, and they don't want to hear anything against it. So if you say something against, this modern design, they're going to just come back at you, because it's kind of the way that they think. So their thinking goes into their designs. I'll leave it at that.
That's okay. Brianna asks, how do we convince the public / government to preserve architectural styles that are not necessarily pretty, like brutalism?
Well, brutalism is a style, so it can be protected because, it has its time and place where it came about. So there's not that much of it out there, so it can be preserved if someone wants it to be preserved. But the government does a whole lot of, has their share of doing contemporary designs too. Yeah, because the GSA has a design excellence program, and it's all about contemporary architecture. You better believe it. It's all about modern.
Very cool. So Liz asks, a bit off topic, though perhaps applicable for the future. Can some of these aspects of historic preservation you presented be applied to space flight hardware, like spent spacecraft, like the Apollo landing sites?
Well, of course, that's not in my category to make the judgment. But that's a little bit different because you always need the latest for technology. You're going into space, so trying to use something historic, that's not going to work.
Hmm,
So yeah, I think you always need the latest there, state of the art designs.
certainly. Megan Hayes asks, what's your opinion on preserving larger historic homes while smaller homes sometimes do not get deserved attention?
Well, of course, it depends on the owner because sometimes the smaller houses don't get preserved because the owner doesn't have the funds to do it or the knowledge of how it should be done. So when you have the larger homes, they usually have um, owners who are better educated in the subject, and of course, they have the finances to back it. So I guess what we need to do is start educating our owners of smaller houses and also helping to find them funding.
Do you have any resources that you could share now with anybody that owns a smaller home that they think might be in need of preservation?
Yes, the city has a whole lot of information about uh, renovating your house, and it's not just for the larger ones. Usually, the larger ones they kind of, you know, have their own category of contractors. But I have been given a list of contractors who have done work here in Shaker Heights, and is combined with an owner of that house, whereas you can call that owner and ask their opinion of that contractor. So that's something new that I just got maybe 2, 3 weeks ago. And Shaker Heights also has a list of contractors. Well, actually, I've used people from the list of contractors from Shaker Heights, and just because they're on that list doesn't mean they're a good contractor. It just means that someone um, has used them before and that they paid to be on the contractors list so we can get permits. Doesn't guarantee the work. So I like the new list better because it has a actual residence who's used a person, and you can actually ask that person questions.
Very cool. Are there any grants or any additional funding that's available for, say, people in the Shaker community or outside of the Shaker community, maybe just like in general, Northeast Ohio, if they wanted to preserve their historic home?
Well, it's a little difficult for personal houses. Now, the city is able to get grants, to protect their government buildings, but the city can also take money that they get and turn it into a grant for the residents. There was a grant that went around 2 years ago. It was for the South Portland community, and that is an area where you have your smaller homes, probably the smallest ones in Shaker Heights, but still they have some design character to them. So as far as governments having grants for the individual personal house, that's not really available until someone takes the government agency has to take it and I guess make it personal through maybe the city.
Fair. David Ellison asks, is it important to preserve the site of the Glenville shootout, or should they build a bunch of townhomes on the site?
Now, David, you already know the answer to this question. He's a historic preservation. He's just want to ask something. Because I'm on the Cleveland Restoration Society as a trustee, we are putting together a civil rights trail, and the Glenville shootout is most likely going to get a marker. So I think the site should be preserved and have the story well told, because as I have found out, there's in-depth stories on both sides. I'll just give you a little brief history about the Glenville in case some people don't know about it. That back in the 60s, during the time of the riots, the Huffs had riots and Glenville had a shootout. And I think it was the early 70s, where there's a militant group that ambushed police coming in the area. So there's a whole lot of shooting going on and killing needlessly. But it was a lot of hurt feelings on the people who did the ambushing because they were revolting from police harassment, shootings, and all that. And then the police felt that they didn't have a whole lot of backing from their side, from their leaders, and sending them out there without enough protection. So it's a real touchy subject. But no, they should not put townhouses on that site. And David Ellison will be the first one out there stopping it.
That's great. So I guess Mark wanted to rescind a couple of his comments and said, I agree that brick and stone does last a lot longer than glass and steel. So he is agreeing.
Well, steel lasts a long time too.
Mm-hmm.
These things just have to be protected and taken care of. It's, more when you get to the metal paneling and all these other new materials and composites and, and they look cheap too.
No, I totally get that. Megan Hayes also wants to comment and says, when I worked at NASA, we documented the historic activities that took place in the buildings, such as the rocket engine test facility. But documenting the historic value and meaning of activities in a building is not the same as preserving the buildings. So
that's correct.
A little comment. Correct. Then she also follows up with mentioning, don't forget about what the Cleveland Restoration Society offers: low interest loans and free technical support, including expert advice and reviewing bids for owners of historic homes in Shaker Heights. Everything over 50 years old, which is 99% of our stock. Not government, but definitely a great financial resource. So in case anyone out there knew about that. But I'm going to give it a couple more seconds for anybody to post anything in the comments or in the chat. But I just wanted to say thank you to Crystal Montgomery. It was a great presentation, genuinely really informative. I learned a lot even. So I greatly appreciate you spending your time with us tonight on this Tuesday evening.
I do have one more thing to read to you.
Okay.
It'll be my conclusion. And I thank you too for having me. I try not to get too long-winded. When you start talking about history, now we can talk about history of every single building we see, and everyone will be asleep, and we'll be the only ones still talking. So I try not to do that to you. But there is a whole lot more to this than what I have on this presentation. But anyway, as we make judgments on what is compatible and what is not, and using the Secretary of Interior standards for justification, we all realize every project will not meet every standard. So as preservationists, we have to draw a line or develop a scale of how much protection has been achieved and how much has not, then make a judgment call. It should be like partial credit in math. You get it, you didn't get it all correct, but being given some credit of what has been done and deciding, is that enough? So making judgment calls on when someone's doing putting a new building in a historic area, or building new, putting addition on, and how it's supposed to look, all these other categories that I have, we have to make judgment calls. So we all kind of go back to the Secretary of Interior standards for justification, because and we kind of go at it that way, because that's something solid that everybody can look at, and we can kind of make judgments, what is done correctly and what is not. So hopefully we can start making better decisions. Well, not better ones. I think we do all pretty good already, but it's just such a subject of what is compatible, what is acceptable, and what is not.
Definitely. That's a really thought-provoking quote. I appreciate you sharing that with us. I appreciate
that wasn't a quote. I wrote that one.
Oh, you wrote that one? Well, it's a quote of you now.
Yes. Actually, I wrote it today.
No, it's great. I mean, it's going to live on now and forever on the internet. Yeah. So,
but I've been thinking about it. How do we handle this compatibility issue? And it's a big issue.
Oh, definitely. But thank you again for spending your time with us and sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us tonight. Again, very thought-provoking and very informative talk. So I appreciate everything you've done and all that you continue to do in your work and in your preservation career. So thank you.
One last thing, all the Shaker residents, you'll be hearing from me again. I won't tell you when and where. It'll just reveal itself.
Very elusive.
Okay.
All right. Well, I just wanted to say again, thank you so much, Crystal Montgomery, for your hanging out with us tonight and giving us this very informative talk. I greatly appreciated it. And I know everyone on our Facebook and on our Zoom has appreciated it as well.
All right. Thank you.